So it's that time of the year again. Runoff season is finally over. The calendar just turned to July 31st, and it's finally time to go up to the mountains and try your hand at some fly fishing for Arctic grayling. And so you get in your car, put on your favorite music, and begin the long drive up Pooter Canyon Road. As you're driving there, you start thinking about fly fishing and what got you into it, why you love it so much, and what fly patterns you plan on tying when you get back home after the good day's session. And then you ask yourself, but how does fly fishing actually work? Because half the flies that I tie don't look really anything like the real flies they're supposed to be mimicking. And what is the science behind that? Well, let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, everybody, and welcome on back to The Science Behind That podcast. I'm your host, Atticus Hamilton, and as you heard from the intro, today, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be talking about the science behind fly fishing. Now, I know that this is probably a pretty unusual topic, I guess, from the topics that I normally do. But fly fishing to me is probably one of my greatest passions. I absolutely love it. I've been doing it for about 8, almost 9 years now. And I'll tell you, even on days when I don't get anything, it just leaves me wanting to go out back for more. And I was talking with one of my coworkers last week about catfish fishing, and I was asking him, where are the good places near where I live, etc., since I'm still not familiar with the East Coast very much. And he was telling me, oh, this place is good, this place is really good, they really like chicken liver here. And I asked him, if he knew what flies they were biting at. And he seemed really surprised that catfish would go after flies. And I started to ask myself the same question. Yeah, why do catfish go after flies? And then that gave me the idea for today's episode. So before we get started, ladies and gentlemen, grab your favorite coffee mug, add a little bit of coffee to that, little bit of maple syrup, and let's jump right in. So fly fishing is one of those things where it is a lot of art and science. And I'm not just saying that because I'm really passionate about it and therefore biased, but it really is. There's a lot of art to it and a lot of science. And ultimately, the question basically comes down to, when we're talking about why do fish bite at senseless, tasteless objects that kind of look like what they're supposed to impersonate, and it gets down to 3 different possible reasons or categories. The first is water tension. Now, there's a lot of flies out there, a large group of flies that are designed to mimic the water tension patterns and the shadow patterns that you would expect for whatever fly they're based on or whatever thing they're based on. And a lot of flies that do that are called dry flies, and we'll get into those in a little bit. Then you have flies that are designed to mimic their, specific thing they're designed to impersonate. They're designed to be enticing visually. And now that could either be by looking exactly like what animal or what fly or insect you're trying to make it look like, or it could be by being really, really shiny. And we'll get into that too, because a lot of those flies are wet flies. And then you could be looking at vibrations and sound. And there are some dry flies that do that, and then there's some wet flies that do that, and we'll get into those as well. So basically, you have 3 different ways that a fly could be enticing. Either, again, based on the surface tension pattern that it leaves on the water, based on how it visually looks, or based on the noise and the vibrations it leaves in the water. And I think when targeting any species, the big question is to ask, what kind of things are these fish eating? in high mountain streams and remote river systems like you have in Colorado and Montana, there are rich ecosystems that completely revolve around those rivers and brooks and creeks, no matter how small they are, which is why you have fly hatches. Now, there's a variety of different species of insect that spend their entire lives on these river systems. The eggs are laid on the rocks in the winter, and they develop, and then they hatch during specific times of year, and the larvae will hang out generally either on the rocks or the surface of the water, and then they'll emerge into their adult form. And that's why you have fly hatches. For example, on the Frying Pan River in Colorado, the blue-winged olive hatches from April 1st to 15th and August 15th, and the end date is October 31st. But the caddisfly hatches from July 1st to September 31st. And this changes based on region and based on area of the world that you're in, and that's going to dictate what type of fly you use. So how does surface tension make a otherwise completely unappetizing piece of animal fur and bird feathers appear as a delicious snack to a fish? Well, let's talk about it. For example, take a remote, rural, high elevation brook in Colorado. The fish that live in that brook probably very rarely see human interaction. And when they're developing, they are learning what to eat, not based on the most specific visual appearance of the caddisflies they eat. They're learning it by looking up at the surface of the water and learning what certain patterns in surface tension mean by this is edible, this isn't edible. And so the fish then start to recognize, oh, well, this surface pattern on the river is something that is edible, and they'll eat it. And they'll taste it, and within 2 seconds or less, a fish can determine if they've taken in food or not. And that's what our dry flies are trying to do. Now, dry flies are flies that most of them are very delicate, and most of them try and mimic the surface tension patterns that you'd see, if a caddisfly lands on the river surface or a blue-winged olive. And they are extremely effective if fished during the time of year that those hatches are occurring. Fish are very intelligent, and we could do an entire episode on the intelligence of fish. And unfortunately, a lot of people think that they can't feel pain or that they're stupid or something like that, which is completely fallacious. Fish are actually very intelligent. And because of that, they are able to recognize that if you throw a caddisfly pattern, in any other time of year that's not July 1st through September 31st, if you're on the Frying Pan River, the fish are going to recognize, yeah, that's kind of odd. I'm not going to strike at that. All because caddisflies have a unique water displacement than like a blue-winged olive does. And that's what the fish are using to recognize those dry flies. Now, how does that change with something like a nymph? Now, for those of you who are not in the fly fishing world, a nymph is basically a wet fly, which means a fly that goes under the water, and it's designed to visually impersonate the larval stage of any of those previous insects we talked about. Blue-winged olive, caddisflies, except golden stoneflies. They all have life cycles that are generally dependent on the river system. And so because of it, they all have nymphal or larval stages, and that's what nymph flies are trying to mimic. Those can be fished outside of the normal time for the hatches, for the dry flies, because in that situation, the fish is either looking for something really shiny, which a lot of them have bright beads on, or they're looking for that pattern because they can recognize, because to them that pattern looks very similar to the larval stages of the insects they eat, and it really does. Now, there are certain instances where You'll have a streamer, for example. A streamer is another type of wet fly, but usually it has like long feathers that flow in the water and then a bright bead at the end. What those are designed to do is not look like anything specific, but they're designed to look like maybe a fish swimming, an injured fish, because the way the feathers will move in the water will make it look like it's injured, and then the bright shiny bead head will also look like an injury. I don't know how many of you guys out there have surfed before, but when you're learning to surf, a lot of times you're told don't wear jewelry because sharks will see the bright shiny color and it'll look enticing to them. And it'll look enticing to them because bright shiny colors in the animal kingdom, in the aquatic world, generally means an injury or a fish that's injured and losing scales because scales are really shiny. And so that's generally how the visual side of wet flies triggers strikes. And then the third and final component is probably one of the most interesting ones, which is vibrations. So there's dry flies and wet flies that cause vibrations that are enticing to fish. So almost all fish have an organ called a lateral line. And basically what a lateral line is, at least predatory fish, what a lateral line is it's a tube. It's a hollow tube that runs down the length of the body, and the fish is able to detect vibrations in the water with this tube, with this organ. And as the vibrations in the water occur, it changes the internal pressure of that lateral line of the tube, and that the fish's brain converts into a recognizable sense of what that vibration is and where it is. And almost all predatory fish have the capacity to sense pressure vibrations in the water. Catfish are a little unique because they use their barbels to do it. But bass, trout, all these fish have that capability. So when you're talking about pressure differences in the water, a great example are bass poppers. Now, there's bass poppers in fly fishing, and then you also have bass poppers in conventional fishing. And basically, in the most basic sense, it's a hollow tube, or it's a tube that has a depression at the end of it, that when you retrieve the lure or the fly, it creates a popping sound, which is a strong vibration in the water. And so let's say you're at the placid little lake with a bunch of lily pads, and you know that there's some big largemouth bass in there. So you pull out your fly rod, you attach a brightly colored bass popper to it, and you start retrieving, and then boom, you get hit by a massive largemouth bass on your third retrieve. Now, why did that happen? Well, as the popper fly is moving across the surface, the sound is creating vibrational waves in the water, and that is creating a signal, basically, in the lateral line of the smallmouth bass. That to the bass, it's like, ooh, that must be something distressed. And when you think about this, most largemouth bass live in habitats where you have frogs, mice, birds, and when they end up in the water, they have a very erratic swimming pattern. And so that creates a lot of vibrations, a lot of disturbance. And a bass popper does just that. A bass popper isn't trying to look like a mouse or look like a frog. It's just trying to create as much popping and disturbance as possible to mimic the disturbance that those animals would. And so to the bass, it feels this disturbance in the water, and it'll look up with his eyes, and a lot of bass poppers have very frilly appendages, which will create a unique displacement in the water, and those two things combined will make the largemouth bass be like, tasty, and will strike it. However, it is interesting because if you are fishing in an area where there are no frogs and there are no mice that end up in the water, bass are not going to go after bass poppers because they are not normally feeding on things that would swim erratically in the water's surface, And so to them, it won't appear as food. But if you're in an area that has a high density of mice and frogs that'll end up in the water and erratically swim around, that is a great lure to use or a great fly to use for bass. Another example is catfish. Catfish, believe it or not, are very predatory. And a lot of people don't realize this. A lot of people think of catfish as just scavengers, garbage eaters. But catfish are surprisingly predatory, regardless of the species. And they will use the barbels right above their mouth, which are those big frilly appendages, to both taste the water and sense pressure variations. So if you're on a river system known for giant catfish and you're fly fishing, the best thing to do is get a big woolly bugger. And a woolly bugger is a heavy fly that's very frilly, and throw that. Let it sink to the bottom and do an erratic retrieve, because that's going to create a lot of pressure vibrations, which to the catfish is going to feel like a dying fish. And the catfish is going to sense out where that fly is, because a lot of them don't have fantastic eyesight. They're going to sense out where that fly is, and they're just going to bite it regardless of what it is. I mean, they can't see what it is very well. They're just going after the vibrations in the water and not taste either. They're just going to bite it because it's going to feel like food. And then you set the hook and you got a catfish at the end of your fly rod. And so I think that's where the art and science comes in, right? Because the science aspect is the physics of how to make a good fly in terms of the appearance in the water, on the surface tension, or how it swims in the water. And the science is also knowing about the habitat that you're fishing in. If you just take a spinner rod and you attach a dead fish to it and you throw it in a lake, you're pretty much going to get a bite anywhere you go for the most part. But fly fishing, you really need to know ecology, and you need to know about the area. You need to be able to say, hey, there's lily pads at this lake, so that means that there's and I live in a region of the world that has frogs, which means that maybe during this time of year a bass popper is a pretty good idea. Or I live right on the ocean, I see a ton of bait fish going by, I should pick a fly that looks as close to those bait fish as possible to entice the sharp-eyed predatory oceanic fish like stripers or bluefish. Or I live in Colorado and Montana, some of the best fly fishing in the world, and it's July 31st. I need to throw either a PMD or a caddisfly or a golden stonefly, and I'll have great luck on the river, depending on the ecology. And so that's why it's science and art. The science is understanding what patterns to use based on the ecology of where you are, based on the feeding habits of your target species, based on the physics of what the fly does in the water, and the art is replicating that on the hook in terms of making the fly. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'm aware that, it's probably not going to be up the alley of all of you. But I just thought this was a fun thing to do. This was a fun episode to do. I really love fly fishing. And if this can at least interest some of you into not only researching more about this, but maybe trying and picking up your first fly rod, well, that's enough to make my day. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Have a great Monday. Have a great rest of your week. I'll see you all on Friday. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, stand up and question everything.